All right, we're back again with the beginning of Chapter 2, which starts our appeals to, emotion. These are fallacies that are going to distract. They still introduce an irrelevancy into the issue, into the argument, but it's going to do so by appealing to a certain emotion. We're all affected by emotions. We tend towards things that make us happy. We stray from those things which, bring us down in some way or we might be fearful of. We are motivated as human beings in lots of ways by our emotions, what we feel, who we want to be around, what ideas we like to embrace, and a lot of that has to do with feelings about things. And so we need to learn how to navigate through some of those feelings and identify when someone is trying to appeal to our emotions, to motivate us to do something or to not do something. And we also need to learn how to avoid making arguments that do the same thing to other people so that we are continuing to stay on the issue at hand and not introduce an irrelevancy into an issue. Not to say in any way that all emotions are all bad and should be avoided at all costs, but there is an appropriate place, an appropriate way that we need to be interacting with our emotions and using them, and then there are other times when we need to stay focused and stay rational as possible.
If I could add a comment there,
sure.
Jolie, I think that's what makes these fallacies kind of tricky, is the fact that as human beings, emotions, they do exist and they're legitimate. Emotions aren't really considered good or bad. They're a part of being human. So when you're feeling pity or when you're feeling fear, that it might be a very legitimate thing to be feeling. But when they're connected to, when they cause us to lose our focus from the issue at hand, then we're getting into the area of a logical fallacy.
And that's precisely that is precisely what this text is hopefully going to teach us to do, which is to just sort of become more aware of the fact that this is something that can happen to us. People can try to play on our emotions, and that we too have a responsibility, and not to be naive in thinking that we don't do it, because we all do, and allow for it in other people too, in legitimate and appropriate ways, and allow ourselves to do it as well. But just understanding that it happens, and so we can best identify what's happening, when it's happening, and how we can move most smoothly through an argument. When we were talking in our introduction about what might be some of the causes why we might be tempted to tend towards bickering or quarreling instead of arguing in this classic sense that we're trying to focus on in this book, we talked about things like pride and having a personal interest in something, and this is an area where emotions can be part of it pretty easily as well. So we'll go ahead and jump in with the first one here and just sort of see how it all plays out. The first fallacy we're going to tackle here in Chapter 2 is fallacy number 5, which is the appeal to fear, or the Argumentum ad Baculum fallacy. Tell me which one of these may be a legitimate appeal to fear. And I'm going to steal the example that you used right before we got started here. I'm a robber in your house. I have a gun. I'm pointing it at your little brother, and I'm saying, show me where your mother's jewelry box is, or else I'm going to shoot Junior here. Is that an ad baculum fallacy, or is something more like you need to be careful of I can use one of the examples from the book here. What if cell phones cause brain cancer? It's better to do without a cell phone and preserve your health. Which one of those two is a real ad baculum fallacy, a real appeal to fear?
The second one.
Okay.
Because the first one, you're commanding someone to do something, and you're giving them a motivation. If they don't, you're not really trying to persuade them into an idea. The second one, you're persuading them to idea by means of threats rather than reasoning.
Exactly. The idea here, and the distinguish between the two, is the appeal to fear fallacy. You're actually trying to persuade someone to adopt your line of thinking, or to adopt your idea in some way. When when you're standing with someone who is a legitimate threat to you, whether it's by force or or by threat of violence and that sort of thing, the person who's in that position of authority or power over you at that moment is not trying to persuade you to adopt their way of thinking. They're not trying to be persuasive to their way of thinking in some way, as though they just want you to do what they say that they want you to do right then and there. It's a command. They're not trying to get you to see the benefits or the upside to thievery or to robbing someone or something. They're not making a real argument there. It's a command, and there's a real difference there. And it's it can be a subtle one. Students might be tempted to, with fear or threat to, go make the joke about. About a real threat, something like that. But that's not the type of thing we're really talking about. Do we have any other examples of real appeals to fear, the ad baculum arguments?
Well, I think when we're little, our parents will use a lot, such as don't stay up too late, the big bad monster will get you, or don't climb on top, don't jump on the bed, you might fall off and hurt yourself, or something like that.
Well, the big bad monster one I'll give you. My daughter actually did fall off the bed and break her arm in 2 places, so that is a legitimate fear, I think, for some parents. But the big bad monster one I'll give you. Yeah, it's staying up too late because a big bad monster would come out is probably just your parents' way of trying to spook you a little bit to get you to go to bed earlier. Any other ad baculum arguments?
There was one, it's been on TV a little bit, about that mayhem coming and surprising you and breaking through your roof or crashing into your car. So he says, get better protected from mayhem like me, otherwise you'll be paying for that new bumper all by yourself.
Those are some great, it's an insurance company, and they have a man who's sort of personifying different kinds of mayhem, whether it's the teenage girl who's emotionally compromised and she drives her car into somebody's parked car at the grocery store, or those flags that people put on their windows to support a university or a college team or something, and the flag flies off and lands on the windshield of another car. Or the one that they did at Christmas time was the Christmas tree that was bundled on the top of the car, but it comes loose and the man pretending to be the Christmas tree flies off and lands on somebody else's car. So yes, that one was all about car insurance and different kinds of home insurance and that sort of thing. And if you don't have the right coverage, you won't be protected from mayhem like all these awful things that happen. So that's a great example.
In the book, as you probably know, there's a couple of fake print ads that feature an insurance company arguing that you ought to get their insurance because you never know when nature is going to strike. And I think Seth's favorite is a crater. There's a huge crater. I think the ad says 23 million years ago, this would have been a bad place to vacation. The implication being that, a meteor could hit your beach, your little spot on the beach, and take you and your family out. So you might as well get that good life insurance.
When I used to teach this logic class, there was a print ad in a magazine, and it had it was just a picture of a man in a shower, just from the chest up, and there was water coming down out of the shower spigot above him, and he was running all down over his face and hands, and obviously over his entire body, and he was rubbing his face with this water. And the tagline underneath the photograph said, "How clean is your water?" And it was an ad for some sewer company or whatever about how the different cleaning of whether or not water was really clean from other companies or not, and that was the same kind. It struck fear in you. I mean, when you think about what kind of water could be running over him and over his whole body and in his eyes and in his mouth, it just kind of makes you cringe a little bit. So there was that fear that struck. Anyone else have another example of an ad baculum argument?
During the Spanish Inquisition, the Spanish government would assassinate people. They would kill people who did not profess to be Catholic. And so essentially they said, recant your Protestantism or we'll kill you. That would be an ad baculum fallacy.
Now, is that an ad baculum fallacy, or is that back to the legitimate fear threat fallacy?
They're trying to get them to adopt their beliefs.
But it's a command, so when something's it's not trying to it's not an argument for something. It's more of a do this or something, we will do something to you. So it's telling you precisely what you need to do rather than trying to have you adopt something.
Well, it seems like an argument to me in the sense that the logic is you should obey us and recant your beliefs, because if you don't do that, a serious consequence will involve. And this seems to, like, isn't this the same argument with the illegitimate fears? It's just that they're illegitimate. So you could argue there could be a really real fear of, the Inquisition will kill you if you don't. Or there could be a really unreal fear that isn't hold ground, but they're still making the same argument, though less legitimate.
It's you're struggling with a point that it's a good one to grapple with. When someone says you have to adopt these particular ideas or we are going to kill you, what do you think the likelihood is? Well, let me ask you this. Are they really doing anything to explain the idea? Are they really trying to be persuasive in outlining the rational, logical thoughts and reasons why you ought to abandon your ideas and adopt the new ones? No, there's no real persuasion. There's no real argument there. And the person who says, yes, I recant, I don't believe anymore. Did that person really change teams? Did they really switch sides on the issue?
No, probably not.
Very likely not. They probably just said whatever they had to say in order to maintain one of their most precious gifts, which is life, right? If there isn't an argument being made for why someone ought to change their mind and what the new idea is, and the only reason for adopting the new idea is that you will die otherwise, because I will kill you, that becomes less of an argument and more of a brutal threat of consequence.
Yeah, coercion. And non-argumentative persuasion.
Correct.
And we've joked about this, that, if the robber comes in and says, give me all your money or I'll shoot you, you probably wouldn't respond by saying, ha ha, that's a fallacy. Because he's not really engaging you in debate. And some other examples, the Spanish Inquisition is somewhat controversial, and to our Catholic viewers out there, I think they would state that this was certainly an aberration from what the Catholic Church wants to be and does. And there are Protestant atrocities too, I would point out, over the course of the centuries. Catholics and Protestants have not always acted in their best interest and according to their own professed virtues. But take some of the totalitarian governments. Where there's been, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and people were compelled to either, to follow this new government or to face persecutions of various kinds, or the persecutions of the ancient Christians. There's a number of examples where force has been used to make people conform to a way of action, but not necessarily very effective in changing a course of belief. Because it's really not an argument that's being made.
Right.
I think it's brought up a lot in global warming arguments today. Cut down on your carbon emissions or reduce your carbon footprint, or the world is going to end.
Okay.
It's not that far, but around that, like New York is going to get flooded, New Orleans is going to get flooded. It's just on and on and on.
The polar ice caps are melting.
And it's all about using your fear of drowning to persuade you to do something that they advocate.
That's right, and that would be a good example of the ad baculum, or the appeal to fear, where an argument is being made, and they've got lots and lots of reasons that they're giving for why we ought to reduce our carbon footprint and why we ought to go green in many ways and cut down on use of electricity and all sorts of things. And in addition to all of those reasons, one of the big overarching principles is that we need to conserve more, waste less, and in doing so, we will preserve the way of life that we currently enjoy on the planet Earth. And the flip side of that coin is that, yes, the polar ice caps are melting because of the greenhouse effect, and then the waters are going to rise, and cities are going to flood, and then all of these bad, negative things could happen. So, but they're actually trying to change people's belief about use and waste and recycling and those sorts of things, in the process of it. And that's where the navigation has to happen about figuring out what is real and what is not real, what is fact and what is trumped up pieces of information. But there is that element of fear that goes along with it as well. And so that becomes a very good point.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to point out, as you did with the fact that your daughter broke her arm jumping off the bed, that there are legitimate appeals to fear. Mm-hmm. And even insurance companies can make legitimate appeals to fear. Part of what they do is to protect you against unlikely events that are bad. Mm-hmm. But you do need to think about the possibility, say, when it comes to life insurance, that you may die. No one really likes to think about that, but it's might be a legitimate appeal. Or car insurance. Maybe we don't want to think about the fact that we may be in a car accident and have to pay money and might get injured, but there is a real fear that we could be hurt driving or hurt others driving. So being able to parse out when is it a reasonable fear and when is it not is part of determining whether you have a fallacy or not too.
How can we do that? How can we figure out when the argument is motivated by fear for fear's sake? So is a coercion mechanism or maybe not coercion, but as abusing the fallacy, the ad baculum fallacy, and when is it a legitimate fear? How do we figure that out? Any ideas?
I think just looking for the end goal, like with the robber, they don't care if you want to show them the jewelry box or not. They just want you to. So, but with anything else, they're trying to get you with the green. They're trying to get you to go green because it has negative connotations, but they really want you to adopt their way of thinking. Mm-hmm. So, if they're actually trying to get you to change your thought, or if they're just trying to get you to do what they want.
When do we know if it's a legitimate fear, like falling off jumping on the bed? Now, she was 3 years old and she was jumping on the bed and she fell off because she lost her balance. And so, maybe the likelihood of you all jumping on the bed and losing your balance is a little bit less because you're a lot older than 3. But, when does it become a legitimate fear on my part? I have told my daughter, you may not jump on the bed again because you don't want to be wearing a cast again for your arm. You don't want to hurt yourself again. When does it become a legitimate fear and when is it just an ad baculum argument?
Well, I think you need to ask yourself, what are they trying to do, and is the fear a necessary result of that? And if it is a necessary or even just reasonable result of that, then it's probably a legitimate appeal.
Okay.
If the fear is artificially inserted into it, or the word it's twisted, or it doesn't make too much sense, there's a feeling of something's being hidden.
Okay.
As I believe we talked about earlier, a lot of these fallacies have something hidden about them. Mm-hmm. Then we can usually assume that it's not legitimate. But if you examine the endpoint in terms of reasons they list, and if fear is a necessary result of these things that they think may be or may happen, then it's legitimate, like Grace was saying.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in the book, there's a couple fashion ads, and the ad is suggesting that if you're caught wearing these clothes, what may happen? You could be shunned by your friends if you're not wearing the right fashions. I think that would be a trumped up fear, right? Mm-hmm. Or the one about the brakes. I think Ellen has her book open here. We would not recommend their brakes. You can't always assume that the cheaper brakes are the best brakes for your car. But the image, of course, is showing a crumpled car that's been very badly destroyed. And so the brake company is suggesting that if you don't get their brakes, you have a reasonable chance of being smashed up and maybe killed because you didn't get the right brakes. So it appeals to your fear. And really it's distracting us from the argument that we should be hearing, which is how safe are your brakes compared to the other company's brakes? We don't know. That case isn't even being made. So I would use the word kind of trumped up or manipulated. You feel like your fear is being manipulated beyond what is reasonable. Is maybe one way of looking at it.
And go ahead.
Also, a legitimate fear. So the distinction line, as I'm seeing, between a fallacy and just a plain threat would be a legitimate fear would be one that is not a fallacy. An illegitimate fear would be a fallacy. So, or a potential fear. So if it's not likely that it's a potential that the brakes might happen, does that necessarily mean that they're going to crash every time? They're not giving any statistics as illegitimate. So is that the distinction line you're drawing?
The distinction would be we need to separate out those types of appeals to fear that are real threats that aren't trying to be persuasive in any way. They're just trying to get you to do something immediately because you've been commanded to do so. And we need to set those aside as not being part of the discussion about a persuasive argument. Then we need to sit down and think to ourselves, what is the real argument that's being made here? And if there is an irrelevancy being introduced, that's when what our alert is. Is the irrelevancy some legitimate fear that we need to be cautious and careful of? That there's a real possibility that somebody could fall off, Anna could fall off the bed and break her arm again? Then that would be a legitimate inclusion of fear into my argument. If it's that you might get teased because you're wearing the wrong swim trunks or carrying the wrong purse to school, or your friends might not think you're very cool, then that would be one of those trumped up fears, and that would be irrelevant as to what you're wearing or how you're carrying yourself, that sort of thing.
Here's one of my favorite examples from a commercial. It's the dandruff commercial, where there's a man or a woman. Maybe I've seen one on a plane where a man makes eye contact with an attractive woman, and you can tell that he's kind of paying attention to her and interested in her, and she kind of looks at him coyly, and then there's a little bit of dandruff on her shoulder. She brushes it off, and he sees that, and he's just disgusted, and he turns away in disgust. Oh my goodness, and just get me off this plane. And the implication is that she has lost the chance to meet the love of her life. And this opportunity has now just passed her by, and this man is now gone because of a couple of flakes on her shoulder. So, the ad is essentially saying to us, don't risk losing, the opportunity to meet the person who's going to be your soulmate because you have a few flakes, because you have dandruff. And you'll see that happen in other commercials as well. That would clearly be trumped up.
Absolutely.
In this car ad, as an example, I think we see some similarities to the plane, where it was not in that one. It wasn't giving any information.
You mean the "We Crash Less" advertisement?
Okay.
And if you see some similarities, it's not actually comparing, not giving any statistics. For both drawing away from the point. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. I think there's a similarity between the "We Crash Less" Applegate Airlines one, which was the tu quoque fallacy, because the image is just an image and a tagline, and you kind of have to connect the dots. And with the airplane argument, it's suggesting that we're not going to crash, but other people do crash, or we will crash, but we won't crash as much, rather. And then this one, instead of showing you, they don't show you a crashed airplane, which might also be an effective ad. See an airplane that's just crashed, and say, well, this happens less often when you fly with Applegate. And here they're doing something very similar. They're saying, here's a crashed car, and this won't happen if you use our brakes. So you could almost change the tagline here and say, with our brakes you crash less, and it would be then the tu quoque fallacy. But both of them could appeal to fear. So you could. Just the image is creating fear, right? Mm-hmm. So you could have an advertisement that is both tu quoque, we crash less, and also appeal to fear by showing you the image of a mangled car. They do this in driver's ed courses.
They do. They usually show, an accident of some kind, or the aftermath of an accident, and why you should. Never drive drunk, why you shouldn't drive with someone who's been drinking, why you should obey, all the road signs and be careful. Never, ever have the radio turned up in your car under any circumstances, because that could be a distraction and you could miss something that's important going on. And then, the next image is, catastrophe with, bodies and mangled wreckage and all sorts of things. So absolutely.
We could have a discussion about whether that's legitimate or not legitimate, or whether it's crossing the line and being manipulated manipulative. Clearly, as a father with a daughter who's driving, I sometimes want to appeal. I probably sometimes am tempted to manipulate my daughter's emotions towards fear because I want her to be, I'm so concerned that she be safe. But I need to be careful. But there's clearly a legitimate relationship between safety and driving that needs to be discussed, but maybe not manipulated. So again, this is a walk of wisdom sometimes. It's not always clear right off the bat to know whether it's a fallacy or not.
And it would be short-sighted to dismiss arguments solely because there is an element to fear in them, to immediately say, that's clearly, you're introducing the idea of fear into this argument, so clearly this is an ad baculum argument, so I can dismiss this. That would be short-sighted. It would also be short-sighted to just, make decisions entirely based off of fear all the time, just, for fear of, being hurt or saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. So it is a walk of wisdom. That's a great way to put it.
And it reminds me too, Mrs. Hodge or Jolie. It reminds me of how in any instance when you're really having an argument, you probably have multiple arguments going on, in multiple lines of evidence anyway, or multiple arguments for one case that you're trying to make. So we wouldn't want to fall into thinking that there's just one 3 or 4 sentence you're going to analyze, and that's going to kind of end the discussion. So, for example, if we're arguing about what movie we want to watch this weekend, there might be a long discussion about the time, money, whether the film is the appropriate one to watch. There could be 4 or 5 different issues that relate to the larger issue. So we tend to kind of narrow the focus down to just one example of a fallacy. But if we were discussing, for example, whether or not we should driving safely, I can imagine 4 or 5 different things we'd be talking about. Money, certainly the kind of car you drive, whether it's a big car, small car, whether it itself is safe, your own disposition, getting plenty of rest, and there could be arguments about all of those things. So I just point out these things are usually in real life more complex than the discussions we're having indicate.
That's a good point. I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up then with the appeal to fear fallacy, and we'll see you next time for, let me double check. Thank you. Appeal to pity, fallacy number 6.